I'm excited to be here with you today. We're going to dive right into it. I think you'll find this presentation interesting. We will be talking about global dietary recommendation standards and how the U.S. adheres to them or doesn't. Planetary boundaries are science-based thresholds that, if adhered to and not breached, will help stabilize the Earth's ecosystem. Now, some examples of planetary thresholds are land systems, fresh water use, climate change, and stratospheric ozone depletion. In 2019, the EAT-Lancet Commission on Healthy Diets and Sustainable Food Systems used these planetary thresholds, combined them with assessments of human health, to create these global dietary recommendations that, if everyone in the world adheres to them, we would be able to feed 10 billion people by year 2050. Now, that 10 billion number is important because that's the number that is currently projected we'll see on the planet by year 2050. I like to think of the EAT-Lancet Commission like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? But for food systems, sustainable food systems at that. These dietary recommendations consist of what you would think of intuitively. We need to eat a decent amount of vegetables and fruits, lower amounts of meat, lower amounts of added sugars like soda pop and certain sorts of candy. So I consider the framing of the study we're going to talk about here in a second pretty practical. We have a finite amount of natural resources we must have access to in feeding our world population. We must also sustain these resources in a way our species can access and use them. That is, we have to avoid overheating the planet through excess greenhouse gas emissions and overusing land and water resources for practical reasons. Right? Food can't grow, and we can't feed our livestock and the like without healthy land and water. However, there is little to no data or research showing what the environmental benefits would be if the United States adhered to these EAT-Lancet Commission global dietary recommendations. There's an interesting research gap there that will be filled to an extent here in a second. Another point that is important to highlight is adherence is contingent upon socio-demographic factors, as in adhering to these global dietary recommendations are contingent upon things like race and ethnicity. In fact, race and ethnicity are established predictors of dietary adherence in the United States. Just think about it. Dietary intake patterns differ through cultural and social norms, right? Sometimes they may differ through environmental factors. Socioeconomic factors can play a role. What's also interesting is that these yield disproportionate impacts on environmental degradation, like land, greenhouse gas, and water, has disproportionate impacts in human health factors, as well as perceptions of climate change risk in itself. Given the framing I just overviewed, the present study measures United States adherence to an adapted version of the EAT-Lancet diet score criteria across race and ethnic subgroups. So I'll spend a little more time on the methods than I usually would because I think it's important to frame some things that we'll talk about later when it comes to future research paths. The three media you'll see the results explained in are land, greenhouse gas, and water. Right now you're looking at a diagram of the food system. Towards your left, there is a dotted line that represents the life cycle assessment boundary. And it's bounding production and processing of food, as well as ecosystem functions and impacts. This is representative of the cradle to farm gate activities, which more simply explained means things like food travel, food miles, marketing, and other aspects are not quantified in this study. On the top right side, you'll see another bounded food life cycle stage, and that is preparation and consumption. That represents the food that we would consume in this study at a grams per day clip. This diagram is a methodological flowchart towards your left, it represents where the grams per day consumption data was retrieved. These were government databases, specifically from the U.S. Department of Agriculture or USDA. What we eat in America and the NHANES survey data are collected as dietary recall data. And that's how these consumption data points are retrieved. In the middle, you'll see that 25 basic food items represented by all the major food groups actually correlates with over 500 food commodities and 7,000 food items representative of the expanse of foods consumed in the United States. So this study actually represents all of the food, virtually all of the food consumed in the U.S. On your right side, you see the cradle to farm gate land greenhouse gas and water impact data for the basic food items. And that's where you get the environmental benefits or degradation calculations. There were some adaptations made in this EAT-Lancet Commission dietary framework. The unadapted framework has 14 scoring elements. The adapted version used in this study has 12. Many of you have probably heard of high fructose corn syrup, or HFCS, and it is an added sugar that dominates the US food market, in comparison to other sweeteners at least. I therefore used HFCS as a proxy for added sugars. This was done by estimating the amount of maize or corn needed to produce HFCS in a popular soda pop brand, given that soft drinks and soft drink consumption tends to be the largest source of added sugar intake in the United States. When applied, it was found that added sugars is roughly 2 times more food consumption impact intensive than corn or maize. Now let's get into the results. What you're seeing here is a representation of the as is or business as usual US level adherence to these 12 scoring elements. As you can see, you have red bar graphs, and then you also have green bars represented here. The red suggests that the US does not adhere to that specific criterion. For example, the all vegetables criterion is red because we don't eat enough of vegetables based on the data here. We overeat beef, lamb, and pork. We undereat in the peanuts or tree nuts category. We overeat in the added sugars category. And this results in an 8 out of 12 dietary score. And our goal is to meet 12 out of 12. So what would happen if we adhered to all of these diet score criteria? We would see decreases in land greenhouse gas and water represented by the graph you see here. So the bars that extend below the x-axis represent reductions in environmental degradation, or we could also call them environmental benefits. That brown paper, sandpaper color you see there is representative of the beef, lamb, pork criterion. And then the lighter sandpaper color you see is added sugars. So you can see that beef, lamb, and pork and added sugars would represent a significant decrease in land greenhouse gas and water impacts. What's also interesting to note is that the all vegetables groups and the peanuts or tree nuts groups, if we increase to meet the criteria, would have a negligible increase in land greenhouse gas and water impacts compared to the decreases in beef, lamb, pork, and added sugars. Of course, that's interesting at the US level, but let's look at the racial and ethnic subgroup breakdowns. Here you see the same chart, similar to the US level, but you have the first bar within each criterion representative of the Black subgroup. The middle is always representative of Latinx, and then the last representative of the white subgroup, and color gradations are respective. The Black subgroup meets 7 out of 12 of the criteria, whereas the Latinx subgroup meets the same 7 out of 12. But what's interesting, the white subgroup meets 9 out of 12 of the criteria. And you can see which areas they meet here in the video. But what would happen if we took that business as usual case and brought every subgroup up to meet 12 out of 12 of these scoring elements? Well, we would see decreases in land greenhouse gas and water, similar to what we saw at the US level. But notice that on your right side, the white subgroup would see decreases larger than their Black and Latinx counterparts, although they have a higher business as usual score of 9 out of 12. Well, you can see that that reasoning is connected to the land greenhouse gas and water impacts of beef, lamb, and pork, as well as added sugar intake. So it just goes to show how important it is to consume a healthy amount of beef, lamb, and pork, as well as some other food items. So these implications are wide-ranging. If the US adhered to the EAT-Lancet global dietary recommendations, we could reduce food consumption impacts, land greenhouse gas and water, 28 to 38% across all racial and ethnic subgroups and at the US level. This confirms that we could help achieve our global greenhouse gas reduction goals and join the world in making this effort more tangible. The methods used in this study and the data sets, for that matter, may be adapted to investigate EAT-Lancet Commission adherence in other countries, such as China or India. Well, how could we break down the socio-demographic groups in China? Will we do it via socioeconomic status? What about India? Will we break it down via caste system? I think there are some interesting social constructs to explore as they relate to climate change adaptation and global dietary recommendation adherence, which of course all this feeds into meeting sustainable development goals established by the UN. Lastly, we request that the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as the World Health Organization, address food access equity issues using these study results and findings. These groups already talk about food access broadly. Well, why not also speak about it with more specificity and even come up with more refined approaches in addressing these issues, since we have a study like this established and published? I'll talk a bit about the study limitations. In Haines and What We Eat in America dietary recall data has been argued by some scientists to have physiological inconsistencies, as in the survey respondent information does not seem to match up with what's needed to be consumed as sustenance within the human body. And this lends itself to the arguments made around survey respondents recalling their own food that they consumed a day or a week or so ago. When we tend to answer our own questions in regard to food intake and other matters, sometimes survey respondents tend to give inaccurate responses, right? Maybe a claim of eating more vegetables would be made, or eating more fruits than actually is consumed would be made, or eating less meat than actually is consumed on a daily basis or a consistent basis. Another aspect that's worth mentioning is that 2-day recall data or 48-hour recall data was largely used in this study. Barring the added sugars group, that was an area where 1-day recall data was utilized due to data constraints. And there are some arguments between which recall data should be used, and I can explain more about that in another setting. In all, this means that more accurate dietary intake data would lead to more refined food consumption impact and diet scoring results. So the results that I've shown you could be even more refined and accurate if these other areas are addressed. When it comes to future research and public health impacts, these results compel us to advocate that environmental sustainability be added to the United States Department of Agriculture's Dietary Guidelines for America. The implications could reach all the way to the SNAP program or food stamp program, to school lunch programs. The results also demonstrate that racial and ethnic disparities exist in adhering to these EAT-Lancet Commission criteria. And what's interesting about that is that this study provides a foundational step toward developing dietary interventions or developing food policy for marginalized populations. That's an area that I think many of us would agree we've underperformed in as a country. Another point that's important to note is further investigation is warranted at other spatial scales. The present study looks at the US level across different racial and ethnic subgroups. But we really need to dig into cities, right? How about urban communities, rural communities? State and local spatial scales should be explored, utilizing some of the methods explored here. And if we do that, we'll be able to realize the most effective policy measures and food intervention strategies. And why is this important? Well, global urbanization trends suggest that we're going to see roughly 10 billion people by year 2050. We've mentioned that. But not only that, we're going to see more of the world navigating towards urban centers. And one might think, well, what does that have? What kind of impact does that have on the food system? The answer to that is many, and I don't think we have the greatest handle on what kind of phenomena and challenges we're going to be dealing with. So if we think about these growing urbanized populations, in addition to the growing overall population from roughly 7.8 to 10 billion between now and year 2050, and then the confluence of these urbanized dwellers living in more confined areas with challenges that are increasingly more difficult to overcome, I like to call this confluence of factors social densification, which is a play on the term urban densification. And that actually creates a bit of a framework for the other presentations you're going to see here in this section. With that, I really appreciate your time. I probably was responding to some questions via chat if they happen to emerge, but I'll be moderating here in a little bit. So I'm really excited to talk with you, also see my own share of presentations, and hopefully this was informative and inspiring. Thank you.